we view and see most major events in our country and around the world is portrayed to us, in most cases, by journalists. So understanding journalism and understanding journalists in our ever-growing, polarizing world is so crucial. Our next guest, Jamie Joseph, a rising young journalist with the Epoch Times and Scriber News, has spent the last 4 years diving deep into stories while trying to uphold and maintain true journalistic integrity. So let's dive a little further and see why Jamie is a real American game changer. So, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Writer, been reporting and journalist on a lot of different things. That's why our team wanted you to come here.
Thank you.
So tell me, how did you first get into journalism, and what was your passion, and how did you begin?
So I've always been a writer, always been somebody that wants to express myself through words. I come from a creative family too. Like my aunt is a published young adults fiction author, and my dad's a filmmaker, my brother's a musician, my mom's kind of a Renaissance woman, artist, can build things, do all types of things. So I think it's kind of in my blood to be a creator. And so when I was younger, I did a lot of fiction writing. I kind of wanted to follow in the footsteps of my aunt, do a lot of poetry, and I still do those things on the side. That's still something that I really love to do, but more of maybe like a personal creative expression. And so going into college, I was like, well, how do I merge my passion for writing and storytelling with, landing a solid career? That road of being an author is really tough. And not saying I couldn't do it, but I had this idea where I was like, I have this whole world in my head, this fiction world in my head, and I can write all day endlessly. But I think what really struck me about journalism was it's like there's a world already out there, and there's lots of stories waiting to be told. There's lots of information out there that needs to be translated for people to just be informed. And so I really was intrigued by that. It was intimidating though, because I knew very early on that I did not want to be part of this of this mainstream kind of legacy media. I knew that I wanted to be more independent, and I wanted to be part of a mission that was focused not only on reporting, but focused on maybe changing the direction that news media is headed. And so that's how I wound up at the Epoch Times.
Nice. So you've covered some really crazy stories through your time as a journalist. You were telling me a little bit about your time covering in DC. Why were you there in the first place?
Yeah, so went to DC, this is in December, so right around the time that the election results got certified. So obviously there was a huge uproar of Trump supporters who were upset and wanted to take to the streets and protest before the inauguration. So I went out there with one of my colleagues, and we just hopped on a plane on a Friday night, came back Sunday. The protest was Saturday, and we got off the plane and just hit the streets. I don't recommend that. But yeah, so we went. It was very peaceful during the day. I would say there was around.
So it was mostly peaceful during the day.
It was pretty peaceful during the day. There was like some scuffles, but between counter protesters, there was a small group of Antifa during the day, but it was mainly Trump supporters. I would say around 300,000 to 400,000, and there weren't a lot of media present, but there were some media there. Yeah, so during the day was very peaceful, and then at night, once the sun started going down. From previous experience watching how my other colleagues had been reporting on the riots all year, I knew that, okay, when the sun goes down and you have these two types of groups in the same vicinity, something might happen, and maybe I should just be there. So my friend and I went. We're both women. We're both small. And so and a lot of the news media at this time had left. So I decided, okay, I'm gonna get up on this planter so that I can have leverage, so I can see everything. I don't want to get stuck, because I've seen a lot of my reporter friends get assaulted and hurt really badly if they have their camera too in somebody's face, or if they feel like you're not on their side. So I'm standing up on this planter and I'm watching everything. There's some protesters still out, some Trump supporters, and then you see some counter protesters, some BLM, and there's a lot of like verbal exchange happening, but nothing physical yet, because it's kind of like a 4-block radius, right? And then you've got Metropolitan DC police like on the side, not doing anything, just kind of standing there with their bikes. And so they come around, and it's at least 300 to 800, I would say, Antifa people all dressed in black, beating their drums. They're lighting flags on fire. That whole scene wasn't really reported in the media. I think, Scriber was like the only people, aside from maybe Daily Caller and a couple other ones, that were there covering it. And so, yeah, it's pretty chaotic. And what I observed, though, during that time was just how organized that this counter-protest effort was. And you see the Antifa Medics on the side, and you see the ones who were there as like recorders, kind of writing down everything that's happening, and just in case they get into any legal trouble, they have evidence to back up that they, weren't guilty or whatever it might be. And yeah, so it was just really eye-opening just to get into that world, because 2020 was a huge year for riots,
really big,
and these different groups who are have a lot of friction, and yeah, so that was a really interesting experience.
Yeah, no, that sounds, that's super interesting. That's just, I couldn't even imagine. I would be freaking out a little bit.
I really was.
I'd be freaking out a little bit. So tell me about what made you get into writing about the homeless story.
Okay, yeah, you're talking about Venice Beach.
Yeah.
So I saw an interview with Soledad Ursua. She was she is the chairwoman of the Venice Beach Neighborhood Council. She did an interview with CMAC on California Insider, and she was talking just about how bad the homeless situation had gotten in Venice Beach. And when I heard that, I was like, Venice Beach? I was like, I used to walk down there. I don't know what she's talking about, because that wasn't my experience when I had been there. And she was just saying how bad the trash had gone, fires were being started because there's so many homeless encampments on Venice Beach. And just to give you perspective, right behind Skid Row, Venice Beach has the most homeless people in Los Angeles County, with 2,000 people. Skid Row, I think, is like 5,000 to 6,000, upward of that. And so I decided, okay, well, I want to go down there and see what she's talking about. So after I saw that interview and met up with her, she was showing me around, and I was just in awe. The whole boardwalk is in encampments, and there's trash everywhere. Not even just the boardwalk, but the neighborhoods in Venice. I think it's on Rose Avenue, behind one of the famous Rose cafes. There's a mini Skid Row there. And so they had been asking their city council member, Mike Bonin, to put back into place these regulations that were there pre-COVID. So essentially what happened was, because of COVID, Los Angeles City Council decided to suspend the restriction on homeless encampments and the times in which you could have your tent up. They rolled that back completely. They took away the sanitation crews that would come in and clean up because of COVID, so to limit contact. That was their thinking behind it. But because of that actually invited more homeless people into Venice Beach, because at the same time, the council member, Mike Bonin, declared Venice Beach kind of a sanctuary zone for homeless people. So now you have homeless people from all over California who are being bussed in to Venice Beach. And what's interesting is that Venice Beach has always kind of had a homeless population, but they were artists and entertainers. They were part of the community. Business owners knew them by name, and they were really essential to that Venice Beach kind of grungy vibe, And but there was a restaurant owner that I spoke to, because I saw this video on Twitter circulating where there's 2 or 3 homeless people right outside his restaurant, right near his outdoor dining area, who are just fighting each other, going at it. And you have the homeless people also surrounding. It's like fight night. I think the person who tweeted it was like, oh, who needs MMA when you've got Venice Beach? So they're making jokes about it now. And I remember talking to that business owner, and he was saying, this has been really tough for us because we want our patrons to feel very welcome and safe here, and we've lost a lot of business, not only just because of the pandemic now, but they have the homeless issue on top of it. 54% of fires in Los Angeles were due to homeless encampments this year. That was a statistic by the LA Fire Department. So, and a lot of those happened on Venice Beach. And, there was even a woman who had her house burned down while she wasn't home, and her dog, and it died because of a homeless person.
So what are you covering now? So what is your most recent story?
Most recent story, yeah. So I cover a lot of homelessness, which we talked about, and the last story that I covered was the issue of the animal testing. Right. So essentially, the White Coat Waste Project, they're a advocacy organization against federal animal testing, and they have been doing a lot of whistleblower reports. And one of the reports that came out in October was that there was a lot of beagle testing being done in Dr. Anthony Fauci's NIH bureau. So that was happening in labs in Africa, and then California, Maryland, and I think one other state. And so this national story is breaking that I'm reading about, that I'm seeing, like, oh my gosh, this is a huge issue. You don't really hear about this stuff too much. And I'm sure it's a hot topic as well, because Dr. Anthony Fauci is such a kind of a controversial political figure right now. So that story was able to kind of leverage his reputation right now. And so I'm reading this national story, and I'm seeing like, one of the labs that this is conducted in is California. And me being a California reporter, I'm like, well, I'm going to go and get that California angle.
Absolutely.
Nobody's looking into this laboratory. So I look into this lab, and, they're like a 75-year research center, formerly Stanford Research Institute. The CEO of it was formerly in the Bush administration. And so I'm finding out a lot of this information, and it turns out that they had been doing beagle testing there for many years, I would say at least a decade, on beagles. And so I reached out to the Beagle Freedom Project, which is another advocacy organization based in California who rescues beagles who have been used in lab testing, because Southern California and Northern California are hotspots for beagle testing. And so I got to chat with her, figure out, why beagles and what's going on here. And she said it's the industry's dirty little secret, and they choose beagles because they don't fight back and they'll forgive you. And that was a quote that I used, because I think people can really relate to that, especially dog owners. So, and it is a very controversial issue, animal testing in general. So there is debate in the scientific community about that, but I think more and more scientists that we're seeing are pushing back against animal testing, saying that most of them don't translate over when you give the same medicines to humans, that it's actually harming humans. So there's a lot of debate about that right now in the scientific community, and there was a group of 24 bipartisan Congress members who sent a letter to Dr. Fauci demanding answers to what's necessary about these procedures, and whether we need it in right now for what, and how much is it costing. I think it costed, actually, for all of these operations, $1.65 million in taxpayer funds. So I think they're getting a lot more legal recognition as well, where lawmakers are trying to create change there too.
Do you think the coverage from this will make a difference? Do you think by you cover, many journalists covering this, that this might come to an end?
So this is the thing about journalism, right? That's a good question, because when I heard about this story, naturally I'm a human first. I'm like, oh, puppies. I'm like, no, this is not good, right? But I have to put back on my investigative hat, right? And even the NIH responded as well, or NIAID responded and said, that these tests and these experiments are protected under all of these laws, and pretty much defending it, saying that it's necessary and whatnot, and that a lot of them are released into adoptive care afterwards. That was their response, so I want to be sure to include that. Whether you believe that or not, or whether you think that's valid or whatever, that's for the reader to decide.
Right.
But this is the thing where it's like, I went into this not with the motive to end animal testing, but just to tell the story of this is what's happening, this is what Congress members are doing, this is what advocates are saying, and this is what the NIAID is saying. And so, but because I am so big on just reporting all sides as much as I can in a story, it's hard when you're taking specific angles sometimes. But when you do a good job of reporting the truth as it is, reporting using objective methods to gather that information, naturally change will happen, but it's not it's people taking that story and then taking action. You don't have to create the narrative, create the reality that you want for change to happen. And I think a lot of journalists are entering journalism now as advocates and activists, saying, well, this is the change I want to make. But you can still make change as a result of good journalism.
Exactly, just telling the truth.
Yeah.
How do you think the media in general has covered this stuff?
That's a good question. It's just so complex. I mean, I want to back up really quick.
Right.
I think it's important for people to kind of understand this before we get into this whole Trump era type of reporting. I would call him the father of journalism. In 1690, this was, obviously before the United States was a country, a man named Benjamin Harris. He was a British man living in Boston, so one of the colonies, early colonies. And he did not like what he was seeing in the British newspapers. At this time, the colonies were ruled by the English monarchy. So all their news were British newspapers, very tabloidish. They would just print rumors, no principles whatsoever. I wouldn't even call it journalism at that time. I think it was just kind of like entertainment.
Right.
In a sense, right? So Benjamin Harris comes along and he says, no, I'm going to create this paper for Americans. And this is, obviously before America was born, but that ideal was still in there. And the whole purpose of it was to dispute lies and push back against those papers. And he called it public occurrences, both foreign and domestic. And it's just so interesting too, thinking about back then, they called news events occurrences. I think we could get deeper into that, but it's just very interesting
It's
seeing
like
so he only had one issue, and then the rest of the paper failed because he got so much
What was his
flack.
one issue?
I think one of them, he kind of exposed this sex scandal going on in the royal family, like things like that, kind of really
real taboo.
Yeah, real sharpening the razor, kind of, cutting against the cloth. But that set the tone for the rest of, I would say, up until like the 1890s. But after that, editors after that edition came out in, I would say it was like 1730s, they were struggling with the question of, well, do we follow Benjamin Harris's model of reporting the news as it happens, literally as it happens, accurate reporting, or do we report reality as it ought to be? So then you have this philosophical question that comes in, that is a question that different philosophies, schools of thought have argued is, okay, well then, if you're trying to achieve the endeavor of reporting the truth, you have to answer the question, what is truth then? And so that in itself is going to be different depending on your worldview, again, philosophy, religion.
Absolutely.
It's very different across the board.
What train of thought or what school of thought is dominating media now?
It's hard to say, but I definitely think that the model of objectivity that Benjamin Harris was trying to achieve has kind of evolved into more like subjectivism.
Right.
Different papers have their own agendas, right? And then that's something else too. I don't think a lot of people know. And before America was America, in the 1730s era, this is what they called the party press era. And during this time in New York, as a colony, the political faction at that time, because there weren't parties yet, the political faction at that time was losing, and they really wanted the current New York governor out. So they hired an immigrant, this political faction hired an immigrant to come in and create a newspaper just to push their political faction's agenda so that they could win. And so this kind of government seeing the power that the press holds isn't something new. This has been happening for hundreds of years before America was even America. And then from there, you go into more of this, you see the rise of sensationalism around the 1830s going into the 1890s. Sensationalism, yellow journalism. You see the first media-fueled war between the Spanish and America, where American press were really fanning the flames to go into war for that Cuban colony.
They lied a lot about about what was going on. They really
they sensationalized things. They added events that weren't happening, and so that's like the first kind of.
It's almost in so many ways throughout history we've seen so much of what we've seen even back then is even happening today.
Yes,
so
it's a pattern. Yeah.
You knowing all this, and you have a pretty good understanding of this, you knowing this, taking this into your own career in journalism, like how does that take that into your own approach when you think about journalism, and like how do you yourself approach journalism?
For me personally, what I've started to see within mainstream media is that they are looking at regular people, and maybe they disagree with their opinions, but they they will go into these interviews already with a preconceived notion of what's going on. And so you are no longer looking at this person who was worthy of your time to listen if you are already going in there thinking, well, this person's wrong, and the way that they see reality, the way that they want to solve homelessness, this isn't the right way, because I think this is the way based on my biases, right? And so you no longer are journalists kind of really journalists there to listen. You see a lot more activists coming in, and I think how I combat that and how I think about it, you know, I'm a Christian, so I believe that every human being has intrinsic value that is God-given, and that's kind of where I draw my objective morality from, truly. And I think, and I'm not saying, and that's not to say I'm better than anybody else. Like, that doesn't make me better than anybody else, right? That just means that I hold really, really close to these principles that, you know, that I believe in, that I think, you know, people like Benjamin Harris, like the early pioneers of journalism, they kind of got that. You know, back then it was very Puritan and like a lot of religious influence.
A lot of very beginning of America, for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, Jamie, thank you so much for coming to American Game Changers. Thank you for being on the show. We really appreciate you coming. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Thanks.